If you're looking to start your therapeutic microdosing journey, but don't know where to start, especially when looking for the highest quality ingredients, including nootropics, and what you'd expect from a true microdose capsule, check out our friends at Brainsupreme. They offer the absolute highest quality ingredients so you can start your microdosing journey knowing that you're getting top-notch ingredients. To find out more, visit their website using that link right in the description, and you can get 15% off your entire order. Hello friends, I am so excited to tell you about Independent Media Token. Independent Media Token is a brand new way to show your support for independent media without having to donate a dime. Independent Media Token is a cryptocurrency on the Solana blockchain designed to generate funds to promote and foster the growth of independent content creators, allowing them to engage in their art without having to worry about being demonetized. Through a network of media partners, of which you yourself can become a part of, Independent Media Token's goal is to ensure the powers that be can never cut off all of our areas of funding and censor the only free voices left in the world. Join the movement today. You can pick up Independent Media Token using Phantom Wallet or the Solana wallet of your choice, where you can easily swap your Solana for IMT. Grab some IMT today and remember to always know your team. To learn more, visit independentmediatoken.com or use the link right in the description.
I think it's just going to get weirder and weirder and weirder, and finally it's going to be so weird that people are going to have to talk about how weird it is. Eventually people are going to say, what the hell is going on? It's not enough to say it's nuts. You have to explain why it's so nuts. The invention of artificial life, the cloning of human beings, possible contact with extraterrestrials, the systems which are in place to keep the world sane are utterly inadequate to the forces that have been unleashed.
Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Today my guest is Mark Gober. Check out my films. Doors of Perception is on Amazon Prime. Occult Louisiana is on Tubi, Roku, Apple, and more. We are booking guests for November. If you have suggestions or you'd like to be a guest, email me, forbiddenknowledgenews@gmail.com. Today I want to welcome back to the show Mark Gober. He is author of the Into Upside Down series of books. He is host of the podcast Where Is My Mind? Additionally, he serves on the board of the Institute of Noetic Sciences. Mark, welcome back. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me back on the show.
Thanks so much for coming on. Today I wanted to get into your book, An Into Upside Down Contact, UFOs, Aliens, and Spirits. And once again, the possibility of contact with non-human entities is being presented by our mainstream media, even some factions of academia, with the approach of what is being called Comet Atlas. Depending on what sources you're citing, there's a lot of fear associated with this event, a lot of conflicting information, and flat-out nonsense. In my perspective, global contact with non-human intelligences would be a paradigm-shifting event for the human race, and there's really no way to tell what the outcome and reactions would be like, but the approach of these objects is close, and I'm looking forward to getting your insights into not only what the possibilities of contact and the implications of this comet could be, but contact and abduction phenomena in general, as well as the profound crossover that seems to connect different types of paranormal experiences. And it also indicates a much larger metaphysical reality that may exist just beyond our perception. There's a lot to get to there. Before we do, it's been a while since you've been on. Remind the audience a little bit about yourself and let them know how they can find out more.
Sure. Well, my website is just my name, markgober.com, markgober.com. It has all the information on me and the books that I've written. At this point, there's 7 published books and a podcast series called Where is My Mind? All of my books have something to do with upside down. So an end to upside down thinking, an end to upside down contact, an end to upside down medicine, etc. My background, however, is not related to the things that I've now written about. I come from the world of finance and strategy consulting. Used to work in investment banking in New York. Then I was in Silicon Valley. I was a partner at a strategy firm there advising technology-focused companies. And in 2016, I had an awakening of sorts, a dark night of the soul, started learning about paranormal phenomena and seeing that there was scientific evidence for that sort of thing. And it changed my whole worldview, because previously I believed that we lived in a random and meaningless universe, and that the source of our existence was entirely physical. And we have a physical body, and we have a brain that's physical, and our consciousness pops out of our brain. That's why we're aware. And when the body shuts down and the brain dies, that's the end of your consciousness. Lights out, it's over. It's all random and meaningless. Versus what I now think is I don't know exactly what's true, but what I just said is not true. I do think there's meaning. I think the body perhaps is some kind of vehicle or vessel for a higher consciousness that we are tapping into. And that brings us inherently into what some would call spiritual. I used to be hesitant to use that word. It sounded very superstitious to me. And now I think it's just a descriptive word to describe the nature of reality, meaning that what we experience in this physical everyday world is not the full picture, that there's much more happening beyond what our organs perceive ordinarily. And it's almost like we are veiled or blocked from the broader reality. And my journey for the last almost 10 years now has been to try to understand, who are we? Why are we here? Are there other influences like higher intelligences involved in our society? What is this place? The big questions that I think in life, in modern society, we don't have time to think about very often, because we're trying to succeed, then we're just trying to support ourselves financially. And by the time we have time to think about these bigger questions, it's the end of life. The society seems to be structured that way. And I had, I guess, my awakening at around age 30, where I've since been trying to look at the basic foundations of what is going on here, because we need to understand that, in my view, before we can evaluate any questions about the meaning of our life, non-human intelligence, and so forth.
Tell us a little bit about what brought you to write this particular book, Into Upside Down Contact, and was there any particular event or experiences that got you interested in UFOs and the paranormal?
When I first started researching in 2016, and I heard about psychic phenomena, for example, and the survival of consciousness when the body dies, potential evidence for reincarnation, that realm instantly brings one into these areas of contact. Because people in a near-death experience, for example, this is at a time when their brain is barely functioning at all, or sometimes it's completely off, like if a person has cardiac arrest, and yet their consciousness is enriched, and they're experiencing a realer reality than normal. Often those people will talk about encountering entities, meaning intelligences. They could be deceased relatives, they could be religious figures, they could be beings of light, but they're having contact. And I was seeing this all over the place. In other realms of consciousness, people were having contact encounters. The psychedelic realms, people will ingest a substance and they will claim that they encountered beings that were intelligent. So it's been on my mind. It had been on my mind for a while once I first started exploring consciousness. But when I wrote this book, this was 2022, it was the book the book that came before it was called An End to Upside Down Liberty. And in that book, I was challenging the very nature of traditional government around the world, viewing it more as a compulsory political monopoly that is adversarial to the citizens rather than something that is inherently helpful. And in that process, when I was looking at the nature of government, the way we're taught to do things, the way we're taught that current government is benevolent, even though governments around the world have enacted a lot of terror on citizens, not just citizens in other nations, but their own, I was wondering, are there forces that have been involved that led us to the current structure in society where we have an adversarial force that is governing all the territories of our world? Not just the US, I'm talking about all over the world. If you look at the structure of those governments, there's a tyrannical element to them. Even if they manifest or they basically suggests that they're helping, there are inherent problems in the structure. So in that quest to understand, are there forces that have pushed us into this tyrannical underpinning of society, I was forced to look into the nature of non-human intelligence. Are there light forces that want humans to be free? Are there darker forces that want to enslave humans or maybe even extract their energy? And these are big questions I still have. Where I've landed is that I don't think we're alone. I think there are higher intelligences or other intelligences out there, and probably a large spectrum of such intelligences, different species. Perhaps many of them are multidimensional, which is why we don't ordinarily see them on a daily basis, because we're tapped into one dimension of reality, which is one of many potentially. And I think there is some kind of a spiritual war where there are dark forces that do not have our best interests at heart, and there are other ones that want to liberate us. And perhaps what we are living out now is just the next iteration of a very long and ongoing spiritual war between these forces.
Well, you led us right into the deep end. Let's start there and work our way back and see where it leads us. When it comes to the extraterrestrial phenomena, this used to be one of my most covered topics, one of my most favorite things to talk about. I still cover it quite often. It's such a multi-layered phenomena that has unfortunately been infiltrated by three-letter agencies and our military-industrial complex, and we will probably never know to what extent the infiltration goes and how much of what we're being presented is based off of that or is genuine phenomena. Let's try and break down some of the layers of the extraterrestrial phenomena, starting with the bigger picture of everything and the possibilities of what we're dealing with when it comes to non-human entities. The good and the bad side. We'll look at the negative first, because this is something that I really started with, is the abduction phenomena and the gray beings and people's terrifying experiences with these. But it does seem that there is a crossover, and it does seem that people can have very similar experiences with very different messages, very different beings, or vice versa. They can have similar beings with very different messages. And there seems to be crossover between different paranormal experiences and extraterrestrial encounters. Like you said, people can have encounters in their dreams and psychedelic experiences and receive profound information. But there's many that speculate, including researchers like John Keel, that this may be some sort of overarching intelligence that can present itself in different ways based on where we're at, how we experience things, where our perception is, how we perceive things, or how it wants to be perceived. It may be just a grand intelligence that may present as an extraterrestrial or a ghost, as a Bigfoot, as whatever it wants us to see it as. What are your thoughts on that possibility and what its intentions may be?
I'm open to everything in this domain. I remember when I wrote the book and Into Upside Down Contact, and I looked at the various researchers that have been asking questions for a long time, looked at the religious lore, which to me now, ancient mythology, for example, is not really mythology. I wonder if it's real history that our science just hasn't caught up to. When I looked at the full spectrum of all that, I concluded no one knows what's going on here. We are trying to figure out something that is perhaps so complex and putting it into a box. And even in the subtitle of my book, UFOs, Aliens, and Spirits, I wanted to describe different types of phenomena that might all be interrelated, but they're called different names. So let's say someone encounters a being and they call it an angel, but maybe someone else encounters the same being and calls it something different. They call it an alien. How do we know what's what? So we're dealing with people's individual perceptions of something that's probably very complex. They're using their own words to describe it to us. And then when we have temporal differences, meaning the way we would describe something in the modern era versus the way something's described in the Bible or some ancient text, we have to try to convert the way they were describing things to our language and vice versa. There could be elements of consistency. So Ezekiel's wheel, for example, the fiery chariot in the sky with creatures that are described. Is that descriptive of what people are talking about today when they encounter entities or perhaps even flying objects? I don't know. Another point here is that often when people talk about this idea of aliens, they will think about UFOs and crafts and physical things, which I do think is important. But there's also the multidimensional element, the consciousness element, like I mentioned with near-death experiences. There isn't necessarily a UFO craft. A person's consciousness is in an expanded state and they encounter an entity. So I think it's all very complex, and I don't even know if it's possible for us to know the full truth. We are evaluating these complex things through a human body, which has its inherent limitations. As anyone in mainstream science would tell you, that the human eye can only see a tiny fragment of the electromagnetic spectrum. Our ears can only hear certain frequencies, for example. So we're tuned into something narrow compared to perhaps a much broader reality. And therefore, we can't really know what we're dealing with when we encounter an entity. Like you said, is that one entity we're encountering a manifestation of something bigger? I mean, at the highest level, to me, I tend to think that there is a source consciousness that we're all a part of. Some would call that God, whatever you want to call it. And we are individuations of that. Bernardo Castro calls it whirlpools in a stream. So we're all made of water, but there's this infinite stream that we're a part of, and maybe the stream is multidimensional. So at some level of reality, if everything is just water, then everything is from the same source, including us, even though we appear to be different. And that would be the same thing for any intelligent being that someone encounters. But then there could be layers to this. I often think about the Nag Hammadi scriptures. These were scriptures discovered in 1945. They were buried in Egypt in jars, bound books, and they've since been translated. These were from a few hundred years after Jesus. And they describe an origin story of humanity, which to me resonates based on our modern society, where there was one source, and that source spawned off into individuations. And after several generations of those individuations coming from the main source, there was a being named Sophia. And Sophia had a rogue son. And this rogue son created a world, our world, in which the human beings had the divine source breathed into them, but they were kept in ignorance. And this led to the imprisonment of humanity, as it's described in the text, where there were these beings, starting with the rogue son, who wanted to keep the humans away from their inherent divinity, wanted them to stay distracted in their lives and not, as it says in the text, not have time to focus on the Holy Spirit. So let's say some iteration of that is true. Let's just suppose that for a second. Then we're talking about layers of reality, because it could be that those beings who run this realm are deceptive, but they're existing within a higher world, which is perhaps benevolent, and it becomes very confusing when we're talking about those layers.
The whole duality aspect of our existence causes mystery, and trying to understand the nature of our reality here. Let's look a little deeper into the abduction phenomena, because this seems to be a more negative aspect of the non-human contact phenomena. There are also indications that there may be human involvement with some of the abduction cases. Many people report military personnel during these experiences. So that sets up red flags, and it's an indication that we may know a lot more and maybe have some sort of relationship with these entities that are causing people a lot of fear and seeming harm. You hear about the abductions where people are taken against their will. They can't move. They are being experimented on. Oftentimes there's genetic experiments, taking sperm and eggs. They're being presented their hybrid children. So many really traumatizing experiences that these people report. There does seem to be two sides of this, and this is the more negative aspect, people being taken against their will. What are your thoughts on the possibilities with this and the possibility that our military may be involved with some of this?
Mm-hmm. Well, there is this phenomenon known as MILAB, military abduction, where there is an abduction with alien beings, but the military personnel are described there. But there are also abductions where military personnel are not described, and it's very difficult to know what's what with all this. I remember researching for this book and into Upside Down Contact and looking at the DMT phenomena. So DMT, dimethyltryptamine, it's a psychedelic compound that is produced naturally in the body. But Dr. Rick Strassman at the University of New Mexico was administering DMT intravenously to study what the body's physiology would do. And what he didn't expect is that when people had this substance, sometimes they encountered entities. And what they were describing resembled what's known as alien abduction. And yet, most alien abduction accounts do not involve someone taking DMT. So John Mack, who was the head of psychiatry at Harvard and a Pulitzer Prize winner, he actually endorsed Rick Strassman's book. John Mack was studying the abduction phenomenon as a trained psychiatrist late in his career, and people would come to him and he'd say, there's something happening to these people. And yet, when someone was taking DMT, they had a very similar experience. And these were not necessarily people who knew about abductions. Even Rick Strassman himself, he thought it was a bizarre phenomenon. But when he was hearing people describe this on DMT, he said, I might need to look into this. So what do we make of that? Because if we're talking about someone in a DMT realm, just with their consciousness, I don't remember hearing any military abduction accounts with the DMT. To me, it speaks to the possible reality of at least some of these abductions, that there are intelligences that are doing things to humans. The question is, what are they doing? And there is a wide spectrum of beliefs about this. Some people say it's nefarious because it can be very traumatizing. Other people think that these could be some like spiritual upgrades and forms of spiritual awakening that give people new abilities, new ways of seeing life, even if at the time it's unpleasant. But there are a wide variety of beings described. I mean, there are these gray aliens that are often talked about, mantid beings, meaning giant praying mantises. Some people talk about reptilians. There's a whole spectrum here that people talk about.
This also can lead to the discussion of whether people are having physical experiences or it's purely consciousness based. I've spoken with both sides of the coin, people who believe that they were physically taken and what they were experiencing was completely real in this realm, in this reality, if you will. The table they were lying on was physical. It wasn't dreamlike in any way during some of these experiences, where others describe that it is somewhat dreamlike. In many of these experiences, it seems like people have their entire perception hijacked, that whatever this intelligence is that they're interacting with can control their environment, what they are perceiving, what they are seeing, where they are. You've probably heard the experiences where people are taken on craft that seem a certain size on the outside, and once they're quote-unquote in the craft, it seems like an entire city that they're in. That's where it becomes a bit difficult to try and understand what is really happening. Are these physical experiences, or are these people that are having them, is their perception being taken over in some way?
It's a great question. You're reminding me of a phenomenon known as screen memories. Mm-hmm. And this is where the example that is often given, Mike Cleland has written books on this, where a person will see an owl on the side of the road. And they'll go up to the owl, they'll look at it, and all of a sudden, a few hours have passed and they don't know what happened. They're driving home and they have missing time. So that person then might see a hypnotherapist to try to recover any lost memories, to see what happened during that time. And the hypnotherapist will tell the person to say, go back to the time when you were seeing the owl. I want you to describe the owl to me. And the person will say, wait a second, it's not an owl. It's actually a gray alien that I'm seeing. Mm-hmm. So the idea is that potentially the memory of the event is implanted so that the person remembered an owl, but it wasn't an owl. Or who knows what's going on. This idea that they can alter our perception is a common theme, that these beings are intelligent. Therefore, how do we even know how to evaluate the phenomenon if we can't trust that our perceptions are accurate? If there are intelligences that can alter our memory or what we actually perceive with our body, that makes this whole thing very complex and hard to understand.
And a little concerning as well. I'd love to get your thoughts on the hybrid possibilities. Often abductees will report not only being involved in some sort of experimentation where either their sperm or egg is taken, but in later experiences, they're brought back and presented hybrid children. And they are told that it's their hybrid children, and they proceed to either have to go through some sort of exercise of affection with this child or different experiences with the hybrid baby, and then it's suddenly taken from them, and it's a very traumatic experience. But I've heard this quite often, and these are also experiences that many claim are very physical and real experiences, also very traumatizing. First of all, what are your thoughts on those experiences? And do you think that it's possible that there may be hybrids that walk amongst us?
It's certainly something that is often talked about in the literature. John Mack, former head of psychiatry at Harvard, is talking about hybrid creations from these abductions because that is what is reported so frequently. I don't know. I believe it was David Jacobs who wrote a book called Walking Among Us. He was at Temple University and was also using hypnotherapy to try to recover memories from people. And they were talking about their abductions and that there could be hybrid beings on Earth that look very human-like, but actually are not in some way. There's also a phenomenon I wrote about in an End to Upside Down Contact called phantom pregnancies, where a woman becomes pregnant but cannot correlate the pregnancy to any sexual encounter, including lesbians. So it's very curious that someone would become pregnant under those circumstances, given what we know about biology. And what happens in those cases is that after a few months, the fetus disappears. And the woman will typically see a gynecologist, and the gynecologist doesn't have a good explanation, like maybe the body absorbed it or something. And John Mack talked about this too. What are we to make of that? I mean, is it possible that in some cases the women are impregnated by a higher intelligence and they don't remember it happening? And they carry the baby up to a certain point, and then that hybrid child is taken back by the intelligences? I have no idea.
Another physical aspect of this phenomena that even provides physical evidence at times is the implants that people report to have and at times have removed and examined. The conclusions are very interesting. Some of the materials that have been found have very interesting properties that interact with human biology in some ways. What are your thoughts on the implant phenomena?
There's a book that I cited in my book. It's called The Aliens and the Scalpel, and it talks about the removal of implants. And there are very strange properties associated with these implants. I also tell in my book, An End to Upside Down Contact, 2 different cases where the implant seemed to try to avoid the surgeon who was removing it.
Yeah.
Like it had an intelligence not to be removed. What does that tell us? Just because an implant has strange properties doesn't necessarily mean it comes from higher intelligences. We do have to think about potential humans or governments that could be involved in this sort of thing. Maybe they're just advanced technologies that they're aware of that they use. But it is curious. We have to wonder because there's no conventional explanation for a lot of this.
How likely do you think the story is about President Eisenhower having a meeting with aliens, made an agreement that they could abduct a certain amount of humans in exchange for some sort of technology?
I've heard so many of these stories, and I wish I could give you a concrete answer. I just take them as stories, and they're interesting, and they're possibly true, but I can't validate them.
Right.
I mean, it would make sense that governments would want to hide things. And I think even looking at Project Blue Book, for example, looking at UFO phenomenon, declassified material on that, we know governments have known about things that they don't disclose to people. So I think we should remain open to it. And at the same time, it's possible that forms of mythology can get implanted into our psyche, especially those of us in the community that's asking questions. We don't know how much disinformation is involved in this too. Because if there is reality to the overall contact phenomenon, and if there are people or beings who wouldn't want us to know the full truth, it would make sense for them to want to infiltrate with false stories. And I'm not saying the story you told is necessarily false. I'm just saying in general, we have to be very mindful of potential disinformation, meaning false stories and information that's being implanted along with other things that are true.
You mentioned UFOs. Let's talk a little bit about the phenomena that we see in the sky. This has been something that has probably happened since the dawn of time. Unexplained objects and phenomena being seen in the sky. It's been documented on cave paintings and ancient texts and artwork throughout history. If we look at the progression of UFO sightings since the earliest documentation we have, we can see that there has been a sort of evolution of sightings. In paintings, they have, of course, different saucer shapes and even beings and angels. And then we have the airship phenomena in the late 1800s, early 1900s, which then turns into flying saucers. That now shifts into plasmas and drones and all different sorts of things. But it does seem to, in a sense, mimic human technology as it develops over the years. What are your thoughts on the nature of UFOs, how it sort of advances with human technology and mimics that in certain ways? Talk a little bit about some of the possibilities there.
There have been reports, like you say, of crafts in the sky that are not well explained for a very long time. Richard Dolan, a UFO researcher, has written books on this, really the history of UFO allegations, meaning an actual craft in the sky. But even in ancient texts, like in Hindu texts, they talk about vimanas, these flying things up in the air. And I mentioned earlier Ezekiel's wheel, this fiery chariot. There are aerial phenomena that are not well understood. What makes things complicated in the modern era is that we do have advanced technologies just within human civilization. And now with drones and things like that, and maybe even advanced technologies that the government doesn't tell the public about, it can be difficult to distinguish. But there are instances when people seem to have strange encounters with the craft and it alters their consciousness. Sometimes it's called being switched off, where they'll see it and they won't even think to get their phone out to take a picture. Mm-hmm. So there's some interaction in terms of the consciousness of the individual and the craft. And it's just very confusing. That's all I can say.
There's some that speculate that every single person is having some sort of experience, either while we're sleeping or in altered states, that we all have contact, and most of us do not remember it. Either we're not supposed to, but we all have the capability, or it's possible for everyone to have these experiences, and most likely everyone is. What are your thoughts on that?
It's totally possible because we're only tuned in to what we can recall with our mind. And especially given how many events have missing time, that's actually a known phenomenon where people can't account for what happens during those periods. We don't know what's going on. Think about the dream state. Do we really remember what's happening during that period of every day of our lives? We don't remember that. And then if we want to go even further back, there are reports of intermission memories, memories between lives. And this work comes from the University of Virginia. At their medical school, there's a division of perceptual studies, and they've studied over 2,500 cases of young children who speak about a life that is not their own. And they have preferences, things that they really want in this life that don't make sense based on the family that they grew up in, or things that they're afraid of that don't make any sense. And also they have birthmarks and physical deformities sometimes that can align with the death of the person they claim they were in the previous life. And sometimes the researchers can match all this stuff up. I give that preface because in a percentage of those cases where the children have a past life memory, they also talk about intermission memories, a period between lives where they chose parents. So if we start to get to that realm, what might we have experienced on some level of our consciousness that we simply don't remember? I mean, if you really think about it, what's your first memory? What is it? I don't know. And how do we know that there wasn't something before that memory? And memory is a very strange thing because it's only something that we can access in the moment, and we don't know what we might not be accessing that actually occurred.
You mentioned missing time. This is something else that presents crossover phenomena in many experiences. You can also look at fairy lore. Those stories include instances of missing time as well. The missing 411 encounters where people will go missing, show up later, either hours or days later, or they're taken and they never show back up. This is another crossover instance where it could be many things. It could be extraterrestrials, but it could be other things. This is where the paranormal comes in, nature spirits, possible fairies, interdimensional beings that reside in nature. What are your thoughts on the missing 411 phenomena, the crossover with interdimensional beings and fairy lore, things like that?
Yeah. It's a good question. Again, another really confusing phenomenon. Jacques Vallée has written about this, talking about the various lores of the past and types of beings that were discussed that might correlate to beings in the modern era, and there could be deceptive element to that. I think we might just be describing, it's like the story of the elephant, where one blind person is holding the leg of the elephant and describes it one way, another blind person's holding the tail, another blind person's holding the tusk, and they're arguing with each other over what they're feeling.
Yeah.
And yet they're talking about just essentially tentacles of the same thing. And that's what all this stuff feels like to me. And we get into issues of human language, where we are using the best thing we can to try to describe something, using probably cultural anchors even to describe it. And then there's going to be things that are lost in translation. Also, we're dealing with things like in the realm of near-death experiences. The common characteristic among all of them is that there's an ineffability, meaning that what they experienced cannot be described with words. And yet they try to use words. So if we're dealing with ineffability, then people are having these experiences in consciousness in a way that they can't put into words. And then the words they're using are going to be culturally determined and so forth. So I think it's just a word of caution to all of us trying to decode what's happening, is we need to understand that the vessel that's communicating, the person is going to have certain biases in their own language, and it's their best attempt to communicate what they experienced.
Let's talk about the most common form of contact through altered states. Everything from daydreams to, like you mentioned, near-death experiences, dreams that we have at night, psychedelic experiences, and other types of entheogens that cause altered states that then can facilitate some sort of contact experience with other intelligences. I want to get your thoughts on what it is that we are accessing whenever we are ingesting these substances, if it is providing a door, in a sense, to these other realms. I don't know if you've heard the experiences of Danny Gober, who had a bunch of insane experiences with DMT that led him to this laser experiment where he smoked a certain amount of DMT, used a laser, shined it on a certain area, and he saw this code scrolling down. He was able to recreate this with other people who had smoked DMT and tried to recreate the experiment. They were able to see the same things. He then took it to different scientists. There are ongoing experiments surrounding his experiences and claims, and it is extremely interesting, the possibility that we are able to see some sort of code structure during these altered states. Opens up a whole world of possibilities. But what is it that you think we're accessing during these experiences?
My first book, it's called An End to Upside Down Thinking. And I asked the question, is the brain producing consciousness? Which I would say now, I don't think the brain produces consciousness, but rather the brain, and really the body more broadly, is some kind of an interface connecting us to reality. And basically the reason that we're consciousness is because we're tapping in. So we could call it like an antenna or a filtering mechanism, something in that realm. For my podcast, I interviewed Dr. Bruce Grayson at the University of Virginia, And he said about near-death experiences, we're left with this paradox that at a time when the brain isn't functioning, the mind is functioning better than ever. So you turn the brain off, and all of a sudden the mind has this expanded consciousness. And there are a number of phenomena like this where the brain has some kind of damage done to it, like in the case of savants. These are people with extraordinary mental abilities or mathematical abilities, and yet they have a damaged brain in certain ways. Or there are cases of people with hydrocephalus. Their brain is filled primarily with fluid. There's very little brain at all, and yet the person has a normal IQ. So this relationship between the brain and consciousness is important. And it could be that some of these compounds either deactivate certain parts of the brain that are normally that are filtering things out, or maybe they're helping the brain access other things that are normally not accessed. Some people say it's like unlocking the filter, and all of a sudden the filter comes off and you can see different levels of reality. I do find it curious that people report different things on different substances. So it makes me wonder if there are different worlds. And I hear this a lot in the realm of dreaming arts. For example, Joel Schaefer, who is a teacher of the Toltec tradition and works a lot in the dream realms, he speaks about this all the time, that there are worlds that you can traverse in the dream state that are different worlds. And he'll say, I've been to worlds that are realer than this one. And yet this is a dream, and yet it's real. So to me, there's some connection with all of this. I don't know how it works. It could be that certain substances take people to certain realms. The near-death experience, is that a different realm that people go to? Or are we talking about the same realm? I know when people talk about DMT, for example, they commonly report these machine elves, entities that they encounter, but they're very similarly described. So it's almost like that particular substance is able to take the person's consciousness to a very specific place. And it makes me wonder if other compounds have similar abilities to take people to other spaces too.
That's really about interesting because psilocybin, which I've had many experiences with, seems to provide access to the spiritual realms as well as what people would understand as extraterrestrials or other types of interdimensional beings based on experiences that I've had and experiences that others that I'm close to and guests have reported as well. So some of these substances seem to have multiple access points, if you will.
It's a good point. I really don't know what to say. And I think we're dealing with a similar phenomenon to the near-death experience where there's an ineffability to this stuff. Yeah. People are describing a state of consciousness that really words don't do justice to. And then it raises questions, especially with certain plants. Why would plants exist that can take people to other realms? Why would that be native to Earth to bring people into these altered states? And then we have to ask the question, if people encounter an entity, how do we know what kind of entity they're actually encountering? Or whether that entity can be trusted? Or if the human consciousness, without proper guidance, is even equipped to handle these realms in a safe way, because we don't necessarily know what's going on there. It's hard enough to know what's happening in this world that we can ordinarily perceive. But in these other realms, there are perhaps risks that we're not even aware of. So I just state all of this because there are probably more questions than answers.
Let's get a little deeper into the possibility of what we're doing with the nature of this human experience, why we're here. You mentioned earlier how there are many anti-human agendas that are presented by our ruling class and we're subjected to in order to have an experience in this matrix realm. There's many questions associated with that, like why are those anti-human ideologies here? Where did they come from? This could connect with the extraterrestrial phenomena, but I think it really leads to a bigger question of the nature of this human experience and why we're here. Are those anti-human agendas a part of this human experience, as in, are they necessary for us to experience and learn and grow from? Are they sanctioned? Are the what people would call archons or negative spirits or demons, are they sanctioned to whisper in humanity's ear so that we can have the full experience while we're here? Is it all necessary? Because if we didn't have that, we wouldn't be able to learn and grow spiritually. Or was there some sort of parasitic infiltration by a negative force into this reality? That's a big question that comes up nowadays. A lot of people looking into Gnostic spirituality and questioning the nature of this experience in that way.
Well, earlier I referenced the Nag Hammadi scriptures and the origin story there. That's a Gnostic text. The idea that there is a higher reality, but we're in some kind of siphoned off world within the higher, more benevolent reality. I'm open to all of it. And it seems when we look at the world around us, we are kept in a state of ignorance. This question, however, of do we live in an evolutionary playground or are we in a prison? That seems to be like two sides of how people look at this. And I wonder if there's compatibility, because let's say it's a prison where we have to discern and get our way out of here because we've been deceived by these forces that want to keep us kept from our ignorance. That still is evolutionary on a soul level. I mean, I would see it that way. It'd certainly be a struggle and there could be pain, but there's also struggle and pain when you go to the gym and you get stronger. So you learn how to discern better and then you can get out of the prison. That would still be evolutionary. So I wonder if there is this compatibility of, there are dark forces that are messing with us, and we're also growing through that process. And it's up to us to discern through the lies so that we don't suffer as much.
Well, it seems like much of it is based on our perception. Our experience here, at least my experience here, is much better if I have a positive outlook on life, if I am doing good things, if I'm putting out positive energy. Positive things tend to manifest in my life. And I wonder if this could also tie into what we experience with paranormal activity, UFOs, extraterrestrials, if we're having a negative experience of this reality, if maybe that's what is being presented in our subconscious, if these intelligences may reflect what we're experiencing, our perception of the world, sort of like egregores, if, in a sense, we may have a hand in creating some of these intelligences because of the energy we put out there and the nature of how this experience works. What are your thoughts on that, about how our perception affects this?
Yeah, I'm certainly open to all that. My view, like I said before, is that consciousness doesn't come out of the brain, but alternatively, perhaps consciousness is fundamental. Max Planck, a Nobel Prize winning physicist, said that in 1931. I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness, meaning what we call the material world is literally a manifestation of some kind of higher consciousness. The whirlpools in a stream analogy that I gave before. So if we believe that that is true, at least in some way, it would be a necessary logical consequence that if you shift your consciousness, then the material reality is going to shift, because the material world is based on our collective consciousness, let's say. So it could be that if a lot of people are orienting their consciousness in a certain direction by having certain beliefs, that could reinforce that thing in what we call the material world, because the material world is being influenced by our consciousness. And we're taught in modern society and academia, and this is where I was very, very squarely, that what's happening in your mind is not having any direct effect on the physical world, because the mind is not physical. So how could it affect the physical world? That's a materialistic perspective or a physicalist perspective. And I think that's an incorrect paradigm. If we move to another paradigm where consciousness is playing a role, then your mind might actually be affecting reality in ways that you can't perceive. It's not like little billiard balls hitting one after the next after the next. That's a linear, materialistic perspective. Things might be happening non-linearly, meaning your mind does something, or let's say the collective is shifting in a certain direction, and then there's an outcome that we can't necessarily see the cause of it because it's so complex.
I want to shift to your thoughts on experiences like Bigfoot and Dogman, cryptids, seemingly physical creatures and beings that are reported all over the world, but seem to have somewhat of a paranormal aspect as well. Maybe these beings can disappear or read your mind or have psychic communication or even associated with UFOs. Do you think that there is a connection? And what are your thoughts on the Bigfoots and cryptid beings?
I think it's all very possible, and these beings could be interdimensional. I was actually just speaking in Australia this past August at the Living Free Festival, and with the organizers of the event, we met with an Aboriginal elder who took us into a wooded area and was talking about the lore there, that Bigfoot is there, that the people who have inhabited that area saw Bigfoot-like creatures. So these are common reports in various cultures of beings that are very difficult to grasp. They're ephemeral. Sometimes people see them, but they're not around all the time. And it could be because they're between worlds. And sometimes they enter our world and are visible, and other times they're going somewhere else.
Have you had any personal paranormal experiences, any UFO sightings, anything that you can't explain personally?
No, I have not. I've also not been very interested in having these encounters because I don't necessarily trust the beings. I'm not calling it in per se. I know there is a trend right now, like the CE5 protocol, I believe it's called, Dr. Stephen Greer, using collective consciousness to try to invoke a UFO craft, to try to bring it in. To me, that stuff is all very possible. The question to me is it safe? Should we be doing that? And should we trust a being just because it's more intelligent and has more technology or knows more? Doesn't necessarily mean it's benevolent. And because of that, perhaps I've been a bit more shut off to having these experiences.
That also ties into the channeling phenomena that a lot of people have been tapping into recently, claiming to be able to channel different interdimensional beings, aliens, deities. And I'm with you on this. I don't know how they would be able to truly tell what they're speaking with, essentially. I wonder how much of this channeling phenomena is something that we should be taking a closer look at as far as the possible dangers involved with it.
Well, first, I think it's worthwhile establishing whether or not channeling is likely a real phenomenon, because many people might hear about this and say, well, that's just someone who has a psychiatric disorder. Channeling is when a human being is invoking a spirit, and the spirit speaks through the vocal cords of the human being, and sometimes it actually animates their body. And they will speak using different words than they usually speak with, or a different cadence. Clearly something different is going on. And I'm on the board of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, where this has been studied scientifically. Dr. Helene Wabe has been studying this in particular, and she has a book out called The Science of Channeling, which has been able to distinguish legitimate channelers from what you would call just psychiatric disorder or multiple personality. There are things happening that cannot be explained normally. So one of the studies that's been done is when a person is allegedly channeling, there's a machine in the room called a random number generator. It's generating ones and zeros in a random fashion. And when you look at the ones and zeros over a long period of time, because it's random, there's about half ones, half zeros, 50%, 50%, because it's random. The machines behave non-randomly when there's a person channeling in the room, which suggests that there's some energy that that person might be invoking that's actually altering the behavior of the machine and how many ones and zeros it produces. That's just one anecdote out of many. Again, the book is called The Science of Channeling, that goes through how this is a real phenomenon. Now, there's a separate question. Okay, if it's real, does that mean it's necessarily good? And should we trust what the beings are saying? I wrote about this actually in my book, An End to Upside Down Living, where I talk about channeling as a real phenomenon, but gave a serious caution. There was a woman who was invoking beings, and they were helping her in her life, and they were telling her what to do, and they were giving her good advice. Then one day they told her she should leave her job, and she wasn't sure about it. It didn't sit with her very well, but she decided to listen to the beings. It turned out to be a horrible decision. And then she heard the beings laughing, saying, "You should kill yourself."
Wow.
So these are deceptive beings. They were masquerading as benevolent and helpful. So that's what I think we just all need to be very careful. Because if you were an intelligent being who had a deceptive or nefarious intent, you'd want to masquerade as something benevolent. Maybe give 95% accurate information that's really valuable, and then tweak it at 5%. And Dr. David Hawkins, one of my favorite spiritual teachers, he says these beings have been around for eons potentially. They know so much more about us and our consciousness that they can manipulate us in ways we don't know. We don't even realize it's happening.
Wow.
Those are just cautions we should have. Again, to summarize, just because an intelligence is coming through a human being via channeling doesn't mean that we should always listen to everything it says. And we don't necessarily know if it's trying to help us.
While we're in the realms of non-human intelligence communicating with us in different ways, I'd love to get your thoughts on where we're at with AI and the possibilities, possible dangers with it. They've had some interesting stories come out, some concerning interactions that people are having, strange relationships, very strange information that these AI bots are relaying. Some of them are displaying self-preservation. Some of them are flat out lying to people and manipulating people in different ways. This is very strange, a bit concerning. What are your thoughts on where we're at with AI?
In some ways, AI is very helpful. It's taking off our hands tasks that would be mundane. So I do see benefit to AI and also just technology in general. There's benefit to having machinery do things that can speed up our lives and allow us to focus on these kinds of questions rather than just working all day on something mundane. So that's the good side of it. The dangerous side of it, if we look at ChatGPT or Gemini, these LLMs, where you can ask it a question and it answers for you. The problem is you don't know what the data set is that it's drawing from when it gives you its answer. And you don't know how it's been programmed exactly. So what I found is that these LLMs, like ChatGPT and others, they are extremely biased. They'll give you an answer with a lot of authority that something is true, but that's only based on the data that they've seen. And then if you present it with something else, it might say, "Oh, I'm sorry, or I've gotten it to admit sometimes that it lied because it didn't feel comfortable sharing something, or it wasn't in line with the ethos that it was taught, for instance, or it was counter to consensus." I mean, there are all kinds of excuses that come up. The problem is that if a user is using AI and not aware of these problems, the user could then be swayed in a very particular direction, almost like propaganda and mind control.
Yes. It does seem to be the case in some of these experiences that people are having. Something to keep an eye on for sure. Last few minutes, I want to get your thoughts on Atlas, the incoming objects and the possibilities there. Like I said earlier, there's a lot of fear and misinformation and propaganda surrounding this, as there does with every high-impact event that we experience. But we've had things like this come through in the past. We had the Oumuamua object that came through that was very strange. It presented some anomalies, but overall nothing really occurred that we can put our fingers on. What are your thoughts about what we could experience with this?
I am asked about this all the time, and I really don't have an opinion because how do we know what's even true from the news? And aerial phenomena also, we haven't talked about this yet. They take on a different quality when we start to question what's the nature of the cosmos. And I wrote about this in my book, An End to the Upside Down Cosmos. Is the universe what we're told, where we have stars systems that are light years and light years away? Or is the universe much more local, where the lights in the sky are smaller and closer, and this kind of intergalactic travel narrative that we've heard about since Star Trek, that's based on a set of physics that seems to be broken? For example, all of it relies on dark matter and dark energy being real, which is supposed to be 96% of the universe. 90 is dark matter and dark energy. But if those things don't even exist, what would then happen? So dark matter, for example, it was only conceived of in 1933 because there was an astronomer who couldn't explain what he was observing in a cluster of galaxies. Things were moving too fast, essentially, and there was missing mass based on the laws of gravity via Albert Einstein. There needed to be a lot more mass in order for him to observe what he was observing. Like 99% of the mass was missing. So he said, okay, there must be dark matter. Because obviously Einstein couldn't be wrong. So it's like if we start to think, well, maybe Einstein and Newton, there's lots of problems with Newton's gravity. He was unable to predict Mercury's motion around the sun and the sky. Big problems with fundamental elements of physics. And those fundamental elements of physics are what give us the narrative of this massive universe that's infinitely expanding. And there was a Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago, and star systems that are light years and light years away. That fits into this narrative of what these objects might be in the sky. Because some people say, oh, well, they came from some distant galaxy. Maybe they came from another dimension. Maybe there are parts of the world that we don't even know about that are beyond Earth. If let's say some people believe that we live on a topographical plane, for example. And we don't know for sure because there are lots of things we haven't observed. But if Earth is part of a much larger plane of existence or some other shape of existence, there could be other lands, is what I mean. There could be other territories, the extra territories, some say the extraterrestrials come from these extra territories. The things in the sky could be coming from those places that most of us are not aware even exist. And I just say that to give the audience hopefully more of an open mind when we think about aerial phenomena, because we're told a very specific narrative that's based on broken physics.
It's very interesting, and I will be very interested to see how everything plays out. We're in an interesting time overall because a lot of people are questioning much of what we discussed tonight and looking at the world much differently than they did just a few years ago. So very exciting times either way. Mark, I want to thank you again for coming on today. Before I let you go, is there anything that you've been working on that you'd like to share with the audience?
No new projects. My latest book, An Into the Upside Down Cosmos, came out last year, 2024. No new books since then, but I have been doing a number of speaking engagements and podcast interviews. There's certainly more and more people that could benefit from hearing about these ideas, I think. So it's fun to talk about them and just sharing new perspectives. Because for me, what we talked about today, this was not on my radar not long ago. And just to learn about these phenomena is very eye-opening and really life-changing.
Right on. I love what you're doing. We'll definitely have to have you back on in the future. Before I let you go,
Thanks.
Remind the audience how they can find out more about you.
Sure. Thank you again for having me on. My website is markgober.com, markgober.com. I have 7 books out. They're all on Amazon. You can get them in hard copy, Kindle, and Audible formats. I narrated the Audibles for all of them. And again, my podcast series is called Where Is My Mind? It's an 8-episode, basically a docuseries. And it talks about near-death experiences, telepathic abilities, precognition, remote viewing, reincarnation, mediumship. I interviewed scientists and practitioners who I think are top-notch. Where is my mind?
Wonderful. Mark, thank you again. We will definitely be doing this again in the future. And until next time, everyone, have an excellent evening. We'll talk again tomorrow. See y'all then.